the second video for Chapter 13, and what we'll be doing in this video is figuring out how the Federal Reserve increases or decreases the money supply. But before we do that, we first need to see how banks can change the money supply. Most of the money that is created is actually created by regular, traditional, commercial banks. To illustrate why, let me give you an example. Let's say that I have $1,000 in my pocket, it's been sitting at my house, I haven't been using it, and I decide to deposit it in a bank, maybe in a checking account or a savings account. Let's think about what would happen with that money, okay? So the first thing that happens is I deposit the $1,000, okay? And let's think about what happens. What happens after that money is deposited? What does the bank do with it? The bank can choose to loan out some of this money. Now, how much can they loan? If we're talking about the United States, for most banks, they can loan 90% because the required reserve rate is 10%, okay? So what ends up happening is the bank loans out $900. That's kind of like the most they could possibly loan out, right? So this is like the greatest possible value we could get from this. So maybe the bank loans out $900. That money is spent, right? Because when people borrow money, they're almost always borrowing it so they can spend it. Otherwise, why would you borrow it? So that money is spent. And then think about what happens to it. What happens once that money is spent? Well, think about how it's spent. If it's spent in cash form, that means somebody's got $900. Maybe it's also, alternatively, maybe it's spent via credit card or a debit card. Regardless of what way you think about it being spent, chances are what's going to happen is that money goes back into a bank. Okay? So then that money returns to the bank. Maybe through checking accounts. Okay? So that money goes back into the bank. So now we've got $900 in the bank. And that money is loaned and spent. Okay? Now how much of that is loaned and spent? I kind of got ahead of myself here. How much of that $900 would be loaned and spent? You should be able to answer that. The bank has to hold 10% of that. So the bank has to hold at least 90, okay? So up to $810 is loaned and spent. Okay? And you can imagine this process could continue. That $810 gets spent, ends up in somebody's hands, they take it back, deposit it into the bank, so forth and so forth. So what's amazing about all this is my $1,000 is creating additional funds. Okay, it's quite literally creating additional funds. That's 1,000 here, 900 is spent here, 810 is spent here. So in total now I've got $2,710 for my initial $1,000, and that's just after the first 3 iterations of this process. This can happen many, many times after this. Okay. If this seems weird to you, if you're thinking, well, this isn't actual money being created, remember that M1 includes cash and coins, checking accounts, and traveler's checks. Now, traveler's checks aren't going to be relevant in this discussion, but these first 2 will be. That $1,000 still exists, okay, and that exists as money in very liquid form. But also the money that's in the checking accounts also exists in very liquid form. After all, if I want to spend my $1,000, I can at any point, right? I can use my debit card, I can write a check, I can go to the ATM, so I can access my money. The person that deposited the $900, they can access it too. Everyone down the chain here is going to have the ability to access their money via checking accounts. So all of this money that's being added up here is real money. So what's happening is the banks are creating more money. And in fact, banks create most of the money that's out there. They are the #1 creator of money, not the Federal Reserve. So how much money would this create in total? Well, Let's go back and readdress this question. I've got $1,000 in my pocket and I deposit it in a bank. All right, we could try to do what we just did and add up all of those iterations, but that would take a really long time. Instead, we can use a shortcut. Just like we had the Keynesian multiplier that we discussed way back in chapter 10, there's something called the money multiplier. And it equals 1 divided by the required reserve rate. Right? 1 divided by the required reserve rate is the simple formula for this money multiplier. It's really the same formula as the Keynesian multiplier, just with a different variable attached. Instead of looking at, NPS, we're looking at the required reserve rate. So the money multiplier right now in the U.S., for our example and in the real world, is 1 divided by 0.1, which is 10. And what that means is, for every dollar that initially exists, up to $10 could be generated from that initial dollar. Okay? So every initial dollar of cash or coin could create up to $10 in M1. Okay? And to be clear here, when I say up to $10, that would be $1 initially plus an extra 9 on top of that for a total of $10. Okay? So that's what the money multiplier does, is it creates extra money. And again, it comes from the process of the banks loaning the money out, the money coming back into the banks and getting loaned out again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for my example right here, the total money that could be created is the money multiplier times the initial amount, times that initial 1,000. So up to $10,000 in total money could be created from my initial 1,000. Note that if I don't take the money to the bank, if I just leave it at my house, it doesn't create any extra money at all. So choosing to put your money in the bank ends up being a really important decision for the macro economy. If people take their money out of the bank, let's say people withdraw $10 billion out of banks right now. That's not going to destroy $10 billion worth of money. It's going to destroy a lot more than that, because all those multipliers work in reverse. All the multipliers go away. In other words, if my money's in the bank and I take out 1,000, that could destroy up to $10,000 in total money once you consider the multiplier. Quite a strong effect. All right, so just to see how this works then, from another example, let's call this example 2. Let's say the Fed injects, and we're going to learn in this chapter how they would actually do this. Let's say the Fed injects $40 million into the economy. All right, again, I don't want to explain how we're going to do that yet because we got to talk about it. It's pretty complicated. But let's say they inject $40 million into the economy. And let's assume in this example, let's say the required reserve rate equals 5%. So how much money could this create? In this case, all right, and again, I'm making this 5% up just so we can see a different number for this example. All we need to do is solve for the multiplier. The money multiplier is 1 divided by 5%, so that would be 20. So the maximum amount of money is equal to the money multiplier times that 40 million. And so you would get $800 million. So if the Fed wants to increase the money supply by $800 million, they might think about what they need to initially inject to create that money expansion process. So the banks are going to be crucial to the decisions the Fed makes, and vice versa for that matter. If the Fed wants to increase or decrease the money supply, they have to think about the banks and their actions. Okay. Now for this to happen, okay, notice I put the term max money down there at the bottom. The amount of money that it's going to create in the real world is not a guarantee. It depends on what people do with their money. For the money multiplier to work to its full extent, a couple of things need to happen. One, everyone must take their unused money to a bank. Okay? Obviously, this doesn't happen. Okay? But we're trying to see what that answer, the solution that we got there, for example, 400 million or whatever, what that really means, where it comes from. So everyone must take all their unused money to the bank. That way it can be loaned out. If I leave my money at home, then the money supply process, that money expansion process, doesn't do anything. Meaning if the Fed gives me the $40 million and I just leave it at home, it doesn't create any extra money. It just creates the initial $40 million. So everyone's got to take their unused money to a bank. That way it can be loaned out. And then the other thing that has to happen is the banks have to loan out the maximum. They have to loan out every penny that they're allowed to loan out, okay? So in the U.S., that would mean loan out 90%. If both of those things were to happen, which is unlikely, right? It's probably impossible. But if those two things are going to happen, then you would get the maximum money creation process from this, okay? Banks sometimes don't do this. Sometimes banks will instead choose to hold excess reserves. And that's just money beyond the 10%, okay? So for example, if a bank has deposits of $10,000 and reserves of $1,500, all right, this is a regular U.S. bank with a 10% required reserve rate. How much excess reserves does this bank have? Well, it's got 500. This bank has to hold at least 10% of that. It has to hold at least 1,000. So this bank is choosing to hold $500. That $500 that they don't have to hold, that they're choosing to hold, cannot grow, cannot create any extra money. Okay? So in this case, for the money to fully expand to the greatest extent, the reserves here would have to be 1,000, the bare minimum. For all of this to happen, that would maximize the money creation process. So let's do one more example just to show what that means. So let's say the Fed injects $5 million into the economy. The maximum amount of money that could create is what? Well, we need to find the multiplier, okay? And we're assuming now, like we'll do for most questions, that the required reserve rate is 10% because it really is 10% in the United States. So the max money that this could create is the money multiplier, which is that, times the initial amount created, which is $5 million. And so this would create $50 million in total money. And that's assuming everybody takes all of their extra money to the bank, and the banks always loan out the maximum. Okay? That's the maximum amount of money this could create. What is the minimum amount of money this could create? What's the minimum amount of money this could create? Well, what if the $5 million gets injected into the economy and consumers just hold it? Well, then it's not creating any extra money on top of that. So the minimum amount this could create is $5 million. This sort of explains or gives you some inference of why the Federal Reserve's job is so tough. If people take their money to the bank, the money supply goes up. If the banks are really aggressive with their loans, the money supply will go up. So the bank has to think about these things when it's making decisions. meaning the Fed doesn't have complete control of the amount of money in society. The banks are actually controlling most of it. So the Fed has to anticipate the bank's actions and act accordingly. If it wants to control inflation, it needs to think about what the banks and what the individuals are doing with their money. Okay? So in the real world, how much money would this really create if the Fed did this? Probably, in most economic situations, a lot closer to 50 million. Because most of the money ends up in the banks, and the banks are going to loan out just about the maximum most of the time. So maybe this creates $40 million. Okay? The reason I can't solve for that is that would just be guesswork on my part. Okay? So when I ask you guys on the quiz and on the exam, I'll be asking you to solve for the maximum amount of money because that shows me my upper threshold. The reality is going to be based on whatever happens. People are unpredictable. There's no telling how much is going to be created. Most of the time, though, it gets pretty close to the maximum. Okay? So that's the money expansion process. In fact, I'm going to stop this video now because that shows how banks create money. In the next video, we'll think about how the Fed does it.